Welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England.
Welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England. Ben is the founder of FDAImports.com and a former FDA regulatory counsel who helps companies worldwide navigate the complex intersection of FDA oversight and international trade. I'm Lisa Mosby, and today we're talking about FDA corrective action plans. Ben will explain why so many fall short and what actually leads to FDA approval. Welcome back, Ben.
Hi, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you. Hey, Ben, can you explain to us what is a corrective action plan in the FDA import context, and when does FDA typically require one?
So in the import world, under FDA law, as opposed to like other agencies, everything basically can come into the country unless the government has evidence that it can't. Okay, so it's like the presumption is it comes in. Contrast that with, say, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where nothing comes in unless you have a permit for it, if it's under USDA jurisdiction, right? So it's just the complete opposite. So the FDA, when they find a problem, they're going to try to pin the problem to a specific product and a specific manufacturing operation, right? A foreign facility, not necessarily the importer, right? The importer isn't usually the person who has sort of any control over how the manufacturing is being done. So when the FDA finds a problem, often the agency will put the importer or the foreign supplier, the manufacturer, onto an import alert. And we've talked about import alerts before in other episodes. These are sort of like automatic detentions. They're like, depending upon how hard they are on the company, they might actually be effectively acting as a ban until they get things resolved. Well, when a company goes on import alert, it's because FDA has found a problem that they believe is going to be persistent in the facility, like a salmonella problem in some sort of food product. So when that happens, the FDA is going to keep you on the import alert, and you have to keep testing these future shipments. Now, that's not your CAPA. The CAPA is going to be done by the manufacturer in order to try to get off of the import alert. Right? So I'm the manufacturer. FDA put me on the alert. Now every single shipment is going to be stopped and be tested. To have that end, because it delays and it costs money and my importers don't like it, I have to do a root cause analysis, figure out what happened. Why is there salmonella? And then do a corrective and preventive action plan. I have to identify what I'm going to do to fix it. And then I have to fix it. I have to implement that plan. After I've implemented the plan, now I can start testing future shipments to prove that it worked. And if it worked, then my CAPA has been validated and FDA can remove me from the alert. So that's the typical time that you see a CAPA. The other time you might see it is if FDA happens to do an inspection of the facility, the importer or the foreign facility, and they find problems in the operation. And under those circumstances, it's a similar situation. You identify the problem, you investigate how it happened, you do a CAPA, you implement the CAPA and you validate it and you document everything. And so those are the sort of two typical times that an importer or a foreign facility in the import environment might run into a CAPA.
And then, Ben, why do so many corrective action plans fail to satisfy the FDA, even when companies think they've addressed the issue?
Well, it's usually because the company can't figure out the root cause. And this is not particularly sort of a surprise. I mean, it turns out that if you think, let's use salmonella as an example. Salmonella is ubiquitous, right? I used to be a microbiologist for the Food and Drug Administration before I was an attorney. I did a bunch of things at FDA, and the first thing I did was test food for salmonella. And salmonella is a kind of an organism that's pathogenic, and it actually is everywhere in the environment. It's not that it's like everything you touch has it. It's just that it can be in any place. That's not anaerobic, right? Someplace that has oxygen and has enough water and it's got a food source, salmonella can grow there. And it's a contamination bug, basically. It's like a sanitation bug. So if you have a sanitation problem, you can have a salmonella problem. Well, that means you could have the salmonella entering into the food supply from many, many, many sources. And to try to isolate it can be very, very difficult. And so failure to isolate the cause of the problem, and then implementing a CAPA that obviously fails to address the cause because you didn't identify it. That's sort of the ordinary breakdown. And so under those circumstances, you're going to have to tighten everything down. You're going to have to take steps in every single, make changes in every step of your process to tighten down and reduce the risk of salmonella contamination at every step. Show you did all that, implement all of that, and then start your testing. But it's usually because they can't figure out where it came from, or they forget to check something that's obvious. That's another thing, right? The supplier doesn't check everything. They don't actually investigate everything. Some things are more expensive to investigate. Doing an audit of a supplier of a raw material might be more complicated, but it also might be the source of your salmonella. So failing to take the steps necessary in the investigation is usually the problem, the root cause of a failure in a CAPA.
And then, Ben, how important is documentation and supporting evidence in a corrective action? And what kinds of gaps raise concerns for FDA reviewers?
Well, it's said in most regulatory environments, if you don't document, you didn't do it, period, right? The government doesn't believe you did anything unless you can show it some documentation. It doesn't mean you need third-party witnesses or even a third-party inspector, but you do need to have the kind of commercial documents and processing documents that the government would expect if you in fact did what you said, right? So your CAPA, your RCA, your root cause analysis is a written document identifying all the different things that you looked at in order to investigate and find the cause. And then you isolate out what you think the cause is based upon that investigation. The CAPA is the description of the things you're going to do to address that root cause, and it's written into a document, an actual plan. And then now you've said you're going to make changes. Well, those changes are going to result in documents, right? If I change the process, then I have to change a standard operating procedure that governs that process. I might have to do training. Well, I have to document the training. I may have to add a testing step. Like I might test in a place where I wasn't testing before because I was missing the risk of salmonella entering sort of right before then. I might have a kill step in my process that I need to strengthen. Right? It might be right. Well, every single one of those things is going to be documents that support that you did it. Otherwise, when FDA comes to do an inspection, you can't prove how you make your product. So the document. If you don't document it, you didn't do it. The gaps are usually going to be in a failure to provide what are called implementation records. Right. So I have an SOP that says that when I run a batch, I'm going to make these changes. Well, I have to create a batch document that where someone indicates that they did it, and someone indicates that they supervised that it was done, and then later on someone comes back and reviews the document to show every single process run in the during the shift it was performed, and that's the sign. Well, now you have a document that proves that you actually implemented the CAPA, and a lot of times companies forget to provide those implementation records, and then the government's like, fine, you get an SOP because you didn't prove to me that you did it. Yeah, you tested product, but it could have been Salmonella's ubiquitous. It could have been, it just happened not to be in that particular product. But how do I know you didn't control it?
And what I'm hearing you say, as you create this corrective action plan and you list out all of these systems, how does the FDA evaluate whether this is a real system of change versus a temporary fix?
Yeah, good question. That goes, I think, in part to the investigation, right? Let's say the issue has to do with pesticides, and I'm going to use like sort of real life examples. There's a processing facility that's managing, they're processing, say a nut, some kind of a nut, right? A tree nut, and that tree nut is being farmed by 50 farming operations that are all small farmers that are producing this tree nut, and then the tree nut is then delivered to me, and I do some processing with it, and I ship it to the United States. FDA tests, and they find a pesticide that's illegal, right? Well, where did the pesticide come from? It probably didn't come from my operation because I'm not the farmer, and it's not the kind of pesticide you would add in order to ensure that you don't have some sort of like mold growing or something in the processing. It's the kind of pesticide you add to the plant, and when it's growing, and so now I know it's going to be in one of my 50, right? I have to go figure out how am I going to track that down. And so I'm going to have to do enough that identifies. It's going to be best if I've already got an audit program where I've already I've required my suppliers to already document the pesticides that they use and the ones that they have on the property. Right? They might have pesticides that don't belong on the property for US, but they're okay with respect to, say, Asia. Okay, well, that's fine, but you need to make sure you've isolated those things so they're nowhere near the product that's coming to the United States. So failure to sort of like take those steps, even if it turns out that you've made everybody sign a document that they will not use the wrong pesticide on any of the products that they ship to me, that's one. That, talk about temporary, right? I mean, first of all, the guy who signed the document doesn't work there anymore in 2 weeks, so who knows, like, who's responsible for making sure that that actually happened. Secondly, I never validated or verified anything, so that document that says we won't do, we don't know if it was us, but we know it won't be us in the future because we'll make sure we don't have the pesticides around. And I got 50 of those documents, and that's all I got. Yeah, that's a temporary fix, and that's, in fact, it might not even be a fix at all, but it's certainly not going to be. It's a longevity because the people who sign that document might not work there, in the next 3 weeks, and then your document's meaningless.
So once we have documents and we have systems in place, how does timing affect the success of a corrective action plan? And what risks come from submitting something maybe too quickly or waiting too long?
Yeah, that's a great question. So think of it as let's pick a manufacturing operation that's let's say like the production of a vegetable protein. Okay, we'll do soy protein. Yeah, let's use soy protein, which by the way is an allergen, right? So if soy protein is added to any food, you have to have an allergen statement. Don't forget that, right? I have a client actually that recently had a problem because they changed their spray dryers, what they're using to spray dry their products, from a lecithin to a soy lecithin, and they failed to do anything about it. And as a result, they ended up having an allergen problem. So let's take, but that manufacturing process is a continuous process. All right, it never stops. And so defining what a batch is really arbitrary. So you might define your batch based upon the shift. You might have 3 shifts that are 8 hours long each. Now you have 24 hours, and each shift is a batch. And so you're going to need to somehow sort of like verify that the products are being properly processed within that time frame. If I'm always shipping product to the United States, and so as that product is constantly sort of inbound, the import alert happens in the meantime, and I get clean tests of later imported products, but they were processed after the CAPA, right? They were processed way before the CAPA. The CAPA wasn't put into place until a week after finding out about the problem. Well, there was already 20 containers on the water. Those 20 containers are going to have to be tested, but they're not going to account towards the petition because the CAPA wasn't created yet. So the timing is critical. You have to make certain, and by the way, it doesn't matter when the entry was imported or when it was detained or when it was refused or when it was released. What matters is when the product was processed in relation to the CAPA. So you want to get your CAPA done as soon as possible because all your later product is then going to be useful for coming off of the import alert. But it's a good question.
Ben, for companies importing FDA regulated products on an ongoing basis, what steps help to ensure corrective action plans are taken seriously by the FDA when the issue arises? That's where we'll wrap up today.
Yeah, and there's kind of 2 sides to that. I mean, if you think of it in the food space, for instance, there's something called the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, FSVP, and that applies to foods, imported foods. And the FSVP importer is a person who's responsible for verifying that the foreign supplier understands and is complying with FDA requirements with respect to the production of food. And so there's a verification, there's a review and a verification step that has to happen in order for any importer to import food, even if there's no problem, right? If there's no CAPA. If there's a CAPA that arises because there's a failure or there's some testing, by the way, just because FDA finds salmonella, for instance, in food, it doesn't mean you're going to do a recall. Now, if it's ready to eat food, then you're probably going to do a recall. But if it's not, most foods are not ready to eat when they're imported. They require either cooking by the consumer or further processing or some step. So assuming that there's no recall issue, the importer is going to first have to make sure that the manufacturer understands and is complying with FDA requirements generally in order to be able for themselves as the importer to pass an FSVP inspection. The FDA will come do an inspection of the facility. This is true for medical device manufacturers. It's going to be true for cosmetic manufacturers eventually because there's this legislation was given to FDA also. to do it in the cosmetic realm. But it's already in place for foods. So if FDA comes and does an inspection, the importer might have failed to do its FSVP properly. They may have failed to do their verification. Well, now they're the ones that have the root cause problem analysis. They're the ones that have the CAPA, the importer. And it might be the foreign suppliers are perfectly fine, but the importer failed to do its verification to show that the foreign supplier is perfectly fine. No CAPA, except now it's the importer's CAPA. Well, the importer, FDA is going to want to make sure that you've done it, and they might do that by coming to do another inspection. FDA does very few foreign inspections, which means they're not going to find the problem by a foreign inspection. They'll probably find it by testing, and they're not going to verify by a foreign inspection. They're going to expect the importer to do it, and they might require a third party to come in and do an audit depending upon how bad it was. But the government is going to expect that you have not just taken steps that you say you took, that you documented, and they might require a third party. Because of FSVP, there's kind of already a third party built into it because the importer is supposed to verify. Those two pieces haven't really been linked together by the FDA very well yet, but it will be. Eventually, FDA will start to say to the importers who are importing product from suppliers that they know we're on an import alert to make sure that they have built into their FSVP the verification that the corrective action was done that was used to get them off the import alert. Right, it's going to be a loop around, and most inspectors of the FDA are not doing that yet. But it would shock me if they don't start doing it soon, because it's an obvious place to find a problem. Right, is that because the importer is supposed to be doing verification anyway. This is true in seafood too. Like the seafood industry has an importer verification step as well to ensure that the foreign supplier of seafood is complying with seafood HACCP. So that's HACCP is Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. It's a safety program for processing seafood. So the government is going to expect the supply chain to be doing it, and then when the government comes to do an inspection, it's probably going to be of the importer, and they're going to try to wag the dog. Right, they're going to use the importer to see if there's a problem in the foreign supplier's plans or their manufacturing or food safety operations by evaluating the importer's verification. If the importer hasn't done the verification, the importer has a problem. So that's mostly how the government handles it. It's really from the import side, because they're not going to. And there's too many foreign facilities. They don't do enough foreign inspections. They'll never be able to do enough foreign inspections. They're going to have to leverage the relationship between the importer and the foreign supplier.
Makes complete sense. Thank you so much for your insights and your guidance today. This was very valuable.
Yeah, we do this work all the time. And so if people are interested in the help, come find us.
And folks, that's it for today's episode of FDA Imports Cross-Border Compliance. If your company has been asked to submit a corrective action plan or is trying to get off an import alert or detention cycle, visit FDAImports.com to connect with Ben and his team. And if this episode was helpful, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone managing FDA compliance with your company. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.